July 29th, 1938, Lake Khasan, Soviet-Manchurian border, the ice that shouldn't exist. Lieutenant Colonel Sato Kotoku pressed field glasses against his face, his breath catching as he focused on the impossible scene unfolding 3 kilometers across the frozen expanse of Lake Khasan. Through the morning mist rising from the ice, dark shapes emerged, not the cautious reconnaissance units he'd expected, but an entire column of Soviet BT-7 tanks moving at what appeared to be full combat speed across ice that Japanese intelligence had deemed impassable for armored vehicles. "Respectfully, Colonel, they cannot be tanks," whispered Major Harada beside him. "Our engineers confirmed yesterday that ice thickness reaches only 40 centimeters in most areas. A tank weighs—" "I know what a tank weighs, Major." Sato's voice carried an edge sharper than the morning cold. He'd spent 15 years in the Kwantung Army, the elite force that protected Manchukuo and represented the emperor's authority in Asia. In those 15 years, he'd learned to trust Japanese military intelligence absolutely. Their meteorological data, their terrain analysis, their assessment of enemy capabilities, all had proven consistently superior to any opponent they'd faced in China. Yet before his eyes, Soviet tanks were doing something Japanese science had declared impossible. The date itself held significance that would only become clear in hindsight. July 29th, 1938 marked a pivotal moment in the undeclared border war between the Soviet Union and Imperial Japan. The conflict centered on possession of Changkufeng Hill and the surrounding terrain near Lake Khasan, where poorly defined borders between Soviet territory, Japanese-controlled Manchukuo, and Korea created a friction point between two expanding empires. For 3 days, Japanese and Soviet forces had skirmished over control of strategic heights overlooking the lake. Japanese intelligence had concluded that Soviet reinforcement would be limited by terrain constraints, particularly the lake itself. Summer temperatures had been exceptionally high, reaching 32 degrees Celsius during the day. No competent commander would risk heavy armor on ice weakened by such conditions. The Soviets, Japanese planners assumed, would be forced to move reinforcements by road, allowing Japanese forces time to consolidate defensive positions. This assumption was about to be comprehensively shattered. The Soviet tanks crossing the ice belonged to the 2nd Mechanized Brigade, attached to the 39th Rifle Corps under the command of General Grigory Stern. These BT-7 fast tanks represented the cutting edge of Soviet armored doctrine vehicles designed for deep operational maneuvers at speeds conventional tanks couldn't match. Technical specifications of the BT-7 revealed capabilities that Japanese intelligence had significantly underestimated. Weight: 13.8 tons. Engine: Michelin M17 tons V12, producing 400 horsepower. Maximum speed: 53 km per hour on roads, 40 km per hour cross-country. But most critically for the current situation, ground pressure: 0.6 kilograms per square centimeter, surprisingly low for an armored vehicle. Soviet engineers had calculated that ice thickness of 40 centimeters could theoretically support the BT-7's weight if, and this was the crucial innovation Japanese observers were witnessing, the tanks maintained constant motion at speeds exceeding 30 kilometers per hour. At high velocity, the tanks would cross the ice before it could fracture beneath their weight, similar to how a stone could skip across water if thrown with sufficient speed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This tactic represented a radical application of physics that Soviet military theorists had been developing since the early 1930s. The concept emerged from observations of cavalry units crossing partially frozen rivers during the Russian Civil War. Mounted troops moving quickly could traverse ice that would collapse under stationary weight. Soviet engineers had hypothesized that the same principle could apply to mechanized units if properly executed. Lieutenant Colonel Sato watched as the lead Soviet tanks reached the midpoint of the lake crossing. Approximately 25 BT-7 seconds were now visible on the ice, maintaining disciplined spacing of 70 to 100 meters between vehicles. The formation suggested careful planning rather than desperate improvisation. "Order immediate artillery fire," Sato commanded. "Target the ice directly. Even if we cannot penetrate their armor, we can fracture the ice beneath them." Major Harada relayed the order to the artillery batteries positioned on Changkufeng Hill. Within minutes, Japanese Type 9 110 5mm howitzers began ranging shots. The first shells impacted 200 meters ahead of the Soviet column, sending geysers of ice and water skyward. But the Soviet tanks didn't slow. If anything, their pace seemed to increase. This response revealed another dimension of Soviet planning that Japanese commanders hadn't anticipated. The tank commanders had been briefed extensively on the physics of their crossing. Slowing down meant concentrating weight on ice for extended periods, inviting catastrophic fracture. Acceleration, paradoxically, was the safest response to enemy fire. Speed distributed weight across greater areas and reduced time spent in any single location. The Japanese artillery adjusted fire, walking shells closer to the moving targets. One round exploded directly beneath a Soviet tank's path, cracking the ice in a spiderweb pattern 50 meters across. The tank reached the fractured area seconds later, its treads throwing up spray as it plowed through standing water, then emerged on solid ice beyond, never breaking stride. Sato felt something unfamiliar in his chest, not quite fear, but a fundamental uncertainty about assumptions he'd held with absolute conviction mere minutes earlier. The entire foundation of Japanese defensive planning for this sector had rested on the premise that Lake Khasan represented an impassable obstacle to Soviet armor. That premise was disintegrating before his eyes, with each meter the Soviet tanks advanced. The historical context of this moment extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Since the early 1930s, tensions between the Soviet Union and Japan had escalated steadily. Japan's occupation of Manchuria in 1931 and subsequent establishment of the puppet state of Manchukuo had created an extended border with Soviet territory. Both nations viewed this region as critical to their strategic interests. For Japan, Manchukuo represented industrial resources, agricultural land, and a buffer zone, protecting the Korean peninsula and Japan itself from Soviet power. For the Soviet Union, the region posed a perpetual threat to Japanese military forces positioned within striking distance of critical Soviet population centers and the Trans-Siberian Railway, the arterial connection binding the Soviet Far East to European Russia. This strategic competition had already produced violent clashes. In June 1937, Soviet and Japanese forces fought a brief but intense battle over an island in the Amur River. Japanese forces prevailed in that engagement, reinforcing perceptions within the Kwantung Army that Soviet military capabilities were inferior to Japanese training and fighting spirit. Those perceptions were now being tested in real time as Soviet tanks completed their crossing of Lake Khasan. The lead BT-7 seconds were approaching the eastern shore, where prepared Japanese defensive positions waited. But the psychological impact of the crossing had already undermined Japanese confidence. Captain Yamamoto Seiji, commanding a company of infantry positioned along the lakeshore, had watched the Soviet approach with growing dread. His defensive plans had anticipated Soviet infantry attacks, perhaps supported by artillery. The possibility of coordinated armored assault from an unexpected direction had never been seriously considered. "Prepare anti-tank guns," Yamamoto ordered, his voice steadier than his thoughts. His company possessed 2 Type 9 437mm anti-tank guns, weapons that could penetrate 20 to 30 millimeters of armor at ranges under 500 meters. Against the BT-7's 30mm maximum armor, these guns were theoretically adequate, but theory and practice diverged dramatically when facing tanks that had just achieved the impossible. The first Soviet tank reached the shore and accelerated up the gentle slope, its 45mm main gun traversing toward Japanese positions. Behind it, 24 more tanks were completing the crossing, spreading into combat formation as they hit solid ground. The Type 94 anti-tank gun crew fired at 400 meters range. The projectile struck the lead BT-7's frontal armor with a sharp clang audible across the battlefield. The tank's armor deflected the shot, the projectiles screaming away in ricochet. The BT-7's machine gun returned fire, forcing the Japanese gun crew to take cover. This exchange, lasting perhaps 10 seconds, encapsulated a brutal truth. Japanese anti-tank weapons were marginally effective against Soviet armor, and only when employed in ideal circumstances. In the chaos of actual combat, with multiple tanks advancing and Japanese infantry struggling to adjust to an unexpected threat axis, those ideal circumstances evaporated. The Soviet tactical doctrine being executed here represented years of development within the Red Army. Since the late 1920s, Soviet military theorists, particularly Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, had championed the concept of deep battle, using mechanized forces to penetrate enemy defenses and exploit breakthroughs at operational depth. The BT series tanks embodied this doctrine. Their designation, Bystrokodny tank, or fast tank, reflected their purpose: rapid maneuver to exploit tactical opportunities before enemies could respond. The Lake Khasan ice crossing demonstrated this concept in its purest form, identifying an obstacle the enemy considered impassable, then moving through it with such speed that defensive preparations became irrelevant. Soviet tank commanders directing this operation had trained extensively for exactly this type of situation. Lieutenant Vladimir Artyomenko, commanding the lead platoon of 5 BT-7 seconds, had practiced coordinated movement across difficult terrain at the tank training grounds near Khabarovsk. The drills emphasized maintaining formation integrity while maximizing speed, precise navigation using terrain features, and immediate transition from movement to combat upon reaching objectives. As Artyomenko's tanks crested the shore embankment, he identified his primary targets through the BT-7's limited vision ports. Japanese defensive positions occupied a low ridge 300 meters ahead. Machine gun nests, infantry trenches, and at least 2 anti-tank guns were visible. Standard doctrine called for neutralizing anti-tank weapons first, then supporting infantry assault. Target anti-tank gun, right flank, 300 meters. Artyomenko directed his gunner through the internal communication system. The 45mm gun elevated slightly. Fire! The high-explosive shell detonated 5 meters from the Japanese gun position, showering the crew with shrapnel. Before they could recover, Artyomenko's bow machine gunner raked the position with 7.62mm fire. The Japanese gun fell silent. Behind Artyomenko, 24 more Soviet tanks were spreading across a 2-kilometer front, systematically engaging every identified Japanese defensive position. The Japanese infantry, trained primarily for fighting Chinese forces and equipped accordingly, found themselves confronting a scale of armored warfare they'd never experienced. Captain Yamamoto attempted to organize a coherent defense, but his company's position was disintegrating. The second Type 94 anti-tank gun managed one shot that disabled a BT-7's track, immobilizing the vehicle. Before the gun crew could celebrate, 3 Soviet tanks concentrated fire on their position, obliterating it in seconds. Japanese infantry armed with Type 38 rifles, a weapon dating to 1905, discovered that small arms fire was completely ineffective against tank armor. The 6.5mm bullets sparked harmlessly off steel plating. A few soldiers attempted to engage with Type 10 grenades, but the BT-7's speed made close approaches suicidal. Within 20 minutes of the first Soviet tank reaching shore, Japanese defensive positions along the eastern lakeshore had ceased to exist as organized resistance. Small groups of survivors retreated toward Changkufeng Hill, attempting to rejoin the main defensive line. Lieutenant Colonel Sato observed this collapse from his command post with deepening concern. The tactical situation had deteriorated with stunning rapidity. More troubling than immediate losses was the strategic implication. Soviet forces possessed capabilities Japanese intelligence had failed to identify. If Soviet tanks could cross supposedly impassable terrain at will, every defensive calculation for Manchukuo's border security required fundamental revision. The temperature was rising as morning progressed toward midday. By 1000 hours, it reached 28 degrees Celsius conditions that should have made the ice crossing even more dangerous. Yet Soviet tanks continued moving across Lake Khasan in successive waves. The 2nd Mechanized Brigade was bringing its full strength to bear, approximately 60 BT-7 tanks plus supporting infantry in armored personnel carriers. Japanese commanders frantically requested reinforcement and air support. The Kwantung Army aviation units based at Harbin received orders to strike Soviet forces on the lake, but coordination delays meant aircraft wouldn't arrive for at least 90 minutes. Those 90 minutes would prove decisive. The Soviet operation demonstrated meticulous planning that Japanese officers were only beginning to appreciate. Soviet engineers had conducted ice reconnaissance for 3 days prior to the assault, measuring thickness at multiple points and calculating weight distribution requirements. They'd identified optimal crossing routes where underwater springs maintained thicker ice. They'd calculated precisely the speed required to traverse weaker sections safely. This preparation reflected a fundamental difference in military culture. The Red Army, despite the devastating purges of 1937 that had eliminated thousands of experienced officers, retained an institutional emphasis on technical proficiency and scientific application to military problems. Soviet military academies taught engineering principles, physics, and mathematics as core requirements. Officers were expected to understand the material science of their weapons and equipment. The Japanese military, while technically competent, placed greater emphasis on fighting spirit and warrior tradition. The concept of seishin kyoiku, spiritual education, held that superior morale and willingness to sacrifice could overcome material disadvantages. This philosophy had worked well against Chinese forces, whose organization and equipment were often inferior to Japanese standards. Against a Soviet enemy that combined technical sophistication with numerical superiority, seishin kyoiku was proving inadequate. By midday on July 29th, Soviet forces had established a solid bridgehead on the eastern shore of Lake Khasan. Over 60 tanks and approximately 2,000 infantry had crossed, constructing hasty defensive positions and preparing to expand their perimeter. Japanese attempts to contain this bridgehead met fierce resistance. The afternoon brought additional shocks to Japanese commanders. Soviet artillery, including 122mm howitzers, began firing from positions on the lake's western shore. The shells, each weighing approximately 25 kilograms, fell with devastating accuracy on Japanese positions. Soviet forward observers, advancing with the tank units, directed fire onto any Japanese strongpoint that showed resistance. This artillery armor coordination demonstrated another Soviet doctrinal advantage. Red Army tactical doctrine emphasized combined arms cooperation, with infantry, tanks, artillery, and air power operating as integrated systems. Japanese doctrine, influenced by the Army's roots in infantry-centric warfare, treated tanks primarily as infantry support weapons rather than independent maneuver forces. The afternoon's fighting settled into a brutal attritional struggle. Japanese forces, despite their shock at Soviet tactics, fought with characteristic determination. The 75th Infantry Regiment launched several counterattacks, attempting to drive Soviet forces back to the lake. These attacks were met with massed tank and artillery fire that inflicted severe casualties. One Japanese infantry company managed to close with Soviet positions near the shoreline. In desperate close-quarters combat, Japanese soldiers used satchel charges to disable 3 BT-7 tanks, but supporting Soviet infantry, armed with PPD submachine guns providing far greater close-range firepower than Japanese bolt-action rifles, cut down the attackers. Of 120 Japanese soldiers who began that assault, fewer than 30 withdrew. As evening approached on July 29th, the tactical situation had stabilized into stalemate. Soviet forces controlled approximately 4 square kilometers of territory east of Lake Khasan. Japanese forces held Changkufeng Hill and the surrounding heights. Neither side possessed sufficient strength for decisive breakthrough, but the strategic momentum had fundamentally shifted. Soviet commanders had demonstrated that Japanese defensive assumptions were dangerously flawed. The Kwantung Army, considered invincible by much of the Japanese public, had been outmaneuvered by an enemy employing tactics that Japanese doctrine hadn't anticipated. Lieutenant Colonel Sato, filing his evening report to higher headquarters, struggled with how to convey the day's events. The factual account was straightforward. Soviet tanks crossed Lake Khasan on ice and established a significant bridgehead, inflicting heavy casualties on defending forces. But the psychological impact, the fundamental questioning of intelligence assessments and tactical assumptions, was harder to capture in a military report. "We must request significant reinforcement," Sato told Major Harada. "The Soviets have demonstrated capabilities beyond our previous estimates. This engagement may expand considerably." Harada nodded grimly. Both officers understood that the Lake Khasan incident had escalated beyond a border skirmish. This was becoming a test of wills between two empires, each seeking to establish dominance along a contested frontier. The evening of July 29th brought no respite. Soviet forces continued consolidating their bridgehead, bringing additional supplies and ammunition across the lake. Japanese artillery harassed these movements, but couldn't interdict them completely. The ice, which Japanese planners had assumed would be their greatest defensive advantage, had become a Soviet supply route. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The night of July 29th to 30th, 1938 proved chaotic on both sides. Soviet forces worked feverishly to entrench their positions, expecting major Japanese counterattack at dawn. Japanese commanders planned exactly that counterattack, despite limited intelligence about Soviet strength and dispositions. In Tokyo, news of the Lake Khasan engagement reached the highest levels of government. The implications extended beyond tactical defeat. Japan's entire strategic position in Asia rested on maintaining a credible deterrent against Soviet power. Any perception that the Kwantung Army could be defeated might embolden Chinese resistance, encourage Soviet aggression elsewhere, and potentially undermine Japanese diplomatic standing. Prime Minister Konoe Fumimaro convened emergency meetings with military leaders. The Army General Staff pressed for escalation, arguing that Japanese prestige demanded decisive victory at Lake Khasan. Chief of the Army General Staff Prince Kanin Kotohito argued for committing additional divisions to the sector, but other voices urged caution. Intelligence reports filtering back from Manchuria described Soviet capabilities in increasingly alarming terms. The tank crossing had been merely the most dramatic example. Soviet artillery appeared more numerous and better coordinated than previous estimates suggested. Soviet infantry showed surprising competence and fighting spirit, contradicting Japanese assumptions that Red Army purges had crippled military effectiveness. Finance Minister Ikeda Shigeaki raised the economic dimension. Japan was already engaged in a massive military campaign in China, consuming enormous resources. A simultaneous major conflict with the Soviet Union could strain Japan's industrial capacity beyond sustainable limits. Oil imports, steel production, ammunition expenditure, all these factors argued against expanding the Lake Khasan engagement into full-scale war. These debates in Tokyo would influence events at Lake Khasan, but with critical time lags. Decisions made on July 30th wouldn't reach frontline commanders until July 31st or August 1st, by which time tactical realities might have shifted dramatically. At Lake Khasan, dawn on July 30th revealed the extent of Soviet reinforcement. Japanese observers counted over 75 tanks now positioned east of the lake, along with substantial infantry forces entrenched in positions protected by tank armor and artillery fire. What had begun as exploitation of a tactical opportunity was becoming a solidly held salient. The Japanese counterattack began at 0600 hours. 2 infantry regiments, reinforced with additional artillery support, advanced toward Soviet positions from multiple directions. The plan called for overwhelming Soviet defenses through simultaneous pressure at several points, preventing Soviet commanders from concentrating their tank reserves. The opening artillery barrage demonstrated both Japanese capabilities and limitations. Japanese gunners were highly trained, capable of accurate fire even with the relatively short-ranged Type 3 875mm field guns that comprised much of their artillery. The barrage fell precisely on identified Soviet positions, inflicting casualties and disrupting defenses. But Soviet defensive preparations absorbed this punishment with minimal disruption to combat capability. Soviet infantry occupied deep trenches with overhead cover, protected from anything except direct hits. Soviet tanks, hull down behind earthen berms, presented minimal targets. When Japanese infantry emerged from their assembly areas to begin the assault, they advanced into carefully prepared killing zones. Soviet artillery, coordinated through forward observers with radio communication, responded with devastating counter-battery fire and defensive barrages. Japanese infantry found themselves caught in overlapping fields of fire from machine guns, tank cannons, and artillery. Casualties mounted rapidly. Captain Tanaka Masao, leading his company in the assault on the Soviet left flank, watched his formation disintegrate under fire. Machine gun tracers laced through his advancing troops. Artillery shells exploded with horrifying precision, each burst cutting down multiple soldiers. Within 10 minutes of crossing the line of departure, his company had lost 30% casualties, without coming within effective rifle range of Soviet positions. "Take cover! Reform behind the ridge!" Tanaka shouted, waving his officers toward a low rise offering defilade from direct fire. The survivors scrambled toward the indicated position, leaving wounded and dead scattered across the bullet-swept ground. Similar scenes unfolded across the entire attack front. Japanese infantry, advancing with courage and determination that would have overwhelmed Chinese defensive positions, discovered that Soviet defenses represented an entirely different challenge. The combination of massed firepower, well-constructed fortifications, and armor support created defensive positions that infantry assault couldn't crack without prohibitive casualties. By mid-morning, the Japanese attack had stalled. Unit commanders reported to Lieutenant Colonel Sato that continuing the assault would result in catastrophic losses without realistic prospect of success. Several battalion commanders recommended withdrawing to starting positions and reassessing strategy. Sato faced an agonizing decision. Military culture demanded aggressive action, immediate counterattack against any enemy incursion. Withdrawing or remaining defensive implied weakness, potentially inviting further Soviet aggression. But continuing futile attacks would squander irreplaceable veteran troops. The practical realities of ammunition expenditure also constrained Japanese options. The morning's fighting had consumed significant portions of available artillery ammunition. Resupply convoys were en route, but logistics in Manchuria's underdeveloped infrastructure meant days might pass before ammunition. Reserves reached adequate levels for sustained operations. Soviet forces, meanwhile, demonstrated no intention of assuming the offensive. Their mission, establishing a defensible position east of Lake Khasan, had been accomplished. Now they consolidated, improving fortifications and waiting for Japanese response. This operational pause allowed both sides to assess the engagement's broader implications. For Japanese commanders, the reality was sobering. Soviet forces had executed a complex combined arms operation with impressive competence. Their intelligence, planning, and execution had consistently surprised and outmaneuvered Japanese responses. Most troubling, Soviet materiel tanks, artillery, and supporting equipment appeared to be available in quantities suggesting substantial reserves beyond what Japanese intelligence had estimated. For Soviet commanders, the Lake Khasan engagement validated recent doctrinal developments. The deep battle concept, emphasizing rapid maneuver and combined arms coordination, had proven effective against a competent opponent. The risks taken during the ice crossing had paid dividends far exceeding potential losses. General Grigory Stern, commanding Soviet forces in the sector, reported to Moscow that Japanese military capabilities, while respectable, did not appear sufficient to threaten Soviet positions if proper defensive measures were implemented. This assessment would influence Soviet strategic thinking for the next year. The afternoon of July 30th brought renewed diplomatic activity alongside military operations. Soviet representatives in Tokyo delivered formal protests about Japanese violation of Soviet territory. Japanese diplomats countered with their own protests about Soviet aggression. Both sides maneuvered for diplomatic advantage, while their armies prepared for continued fighting. But behind these public positions, more pragmatic conversations were occurring. Neither government desired full-scale war. The Soviet Union faced potential conflict with Nazi Germany in Europe, a far more serious threat than Japan. Stalin's purges had decimated Red Army leadership, and while Lake Khasan showed that tactical competence remained, Soviet military capability was weakened overall. Japan, engaged in China and facing resource constraints, similarly had limited appetite for expanding hostilities. The Kwantung Army might desire victory at Lake Khasan for prestige reasons, but rational strategic assessment suggested that even victory would be Pyrrhic. The resources required to defeat Soviet forces in this sector could be more productively employed elsewhere. These strategic realities would eventually lead to negotiated settlement. But in late July and early August 1938, the fighting continued with grim intensity. August first brought Japanese reinforcement to the sector. The 19th Division, transferred from Korea, began arriving with additional artillery and engineer support. Japanese commanders planned a major offensive to recapture territory lost to Soviet advances. This offensive, launched on August 2nd, represented Japan's maximum effort at Lake Khasan. 3 infantry divisions with substantial artillery support attacked Soviet positions from multiple directions. Japanese planners hoped that overwhelming numerical superiority would succeed where earlier attacks had failed. The offensive achieved initial success. Japanese troops captured several Soviet forward positions through sheer weight of numbers, but as attacking forces approached main Soviet defensive lines, they encountered the same devastating firepower that had defeated earlier attacks. Soviet tanks, artillery, and infantry fought stubbornly, contesting every meter of ground. The fighting reached maximum intensity on August 6th through 8th. Japanese forces managed to recapture some lost ground, including portions of Changkufeng Hill's slopes. But Soviet defenses held the critical terrain, dominating Lake Khasan and its approaches. Japanese casualties mounted alarmingly. Estimates suggest between 500 to 700 killed and 1,600 to 2,000 wounded during the engagement's peak. Soviet casualties were substantial but sustainable. Approximately 30 Soviet tanks were destroyed or disabled, a significant loss, but not crippling given overall Soviet armored strength. Infantry casualties numbered approximately 1,000 killed and wounded, roughly equivalent to Japanese losses, but representing a smaller percentage of forces engaged. By August 9th, combat operations were winding down. Both sides recognized that further fighting served no useful purpose. Diplomatic negotiations began in earnest, working towards ceasefire and eventual settlement. The ceasefire took effect on August 11th, 1938. The final territorial settlement slightly favored Soviet positions, giving them control over Changkufeng Hill and the surrounding area. Japanese forces withdrew to positions that would become the recognized border. The Lake Khasan incident's military outcome was technically indecisive. Neither side achieved complete victory, and the territorial adjustments were minor, but the engagement's psychological and strategic impacts were profound and lasting. For the Japanese military, Lake Khasan shattered comfortable assumptions about Soviet military inferiority. The Kwantung Army had encountered a modern, competent military force, employing sophisticated tactics and possessing material superiority in key areas. This revelation forced complete reassessment of Japanese strategic planning for the northern border. Internal Japanese military analyses produced in autumn 1938 identified multiple deficiencies exposed by Lake Khasan. Japanese anti-tank capabilities were inadequate against modern armor. Artillery, while accurate, lacked sufficient weight and range compared to Soviet guns. Infantry tactics, optimized for fighting in China, proved less effective against opponents with comparable training and superior firepower. Most troubling was the recognition that Soviet industrial capacity could sustain military operations at scales Japan couldn't match. The tank crossing that had so shocked Lieutenant Colonel Sato on July 29th represented not desperate improvisation, but systematic application of engineering principles, backed by sufficient material resources to execute complex, Operations. Lieutenant Colonel Sato himself, promoted after the engagement despite tactical defeats, spent the remainder of his career working on defensive doctrine for Manchukuo's northern border. His reports consistently warned that the Kwantung Army faced a sophisticated opponent requiring different tactics and substantially more resources than current allocations provided. For Soviet military planners, Lake Khasan provided valuable lessons that would be applied in subsequent conflicts. The engagement validated combined arms doctrine and highlighted the importance of engineering support for complex operations. Soviet after-action analyses praised the tank unit's execution of the ice crossing while noting areas for improvement in infantry armor coordination. The engagement also provided Stalin and Soviet leadership with useful intelligence about Japanese military capabilities and, perhaps more importantly, Japanese willingness to escalate conflicts. The conclusion drawn in Moscow was that Japan, despite aggressive rhetoric, had limited appetite for major war with the Soviet Union. This assessment influenced Soviet responses to subsequent border incidents, including the much larger battle at Khalkhin Gol in 1939. The tank officers who executed the Lake Khasan ice crossing continued their careers with distinction. Lieutenant Vladimir Artyomenko, whose platoon led the assault across the ice, was decorated and promoted. He would go on to fight in the Winter War against Finland and later against Nazi Germany. His experience at Lake Khasan informed his tactical approach throughout his career, aggressive maneuver combined with careful preparation. The BT-7 tanks that crossed the ice became legends within Soviet armored forces. Crews who participated received recognition, and the operation was studied in Soviet military academies as an example of innovative tactics and bold execution. The principles demonstrated using speed and momentum to overcome obstacles, conventional wisdom deemed impassable, became part of Soviet armored doctrine. For Japanese forces, the memory of Soviet tanks materializing across supposedly impassable terrain haunted defensive planning. Every seemingly secure position now required contingency plans for unexpected enemy approaches. The comfortable certainty that Japanese intelligence assessments were reliably accurate had been undermined, replaced with awareness that opponents might possess capabilities beyond what reconnaissance revealed. This psychological shift influenced Japanese strategic thinking in subtle but important ways. When Japan faced the decision of whether to honor the tripartite pact obligations by attacking the Soviet Union following Nazi Germany's invasion in June 1941, the memories of Lake Khasan and the even more decisive defeat at Khalkhin Gol contributed to Japan's decision to remain neutral and instead focus on expansion into Southeast Asia and the Pacific. The technical lessons learned at Lake Khasan drove equipment development on both sides. Japanese Army allocated resources to developing more effective anti-tank weapons, resulting in improved versions of the Type 94 gun and eventually the Type 14 7mm anti-tank gun. Tank development received renewed emphasis, though Japan's industrial limitations meant that Japanese armor never achieved parity with Soviet equivalents. The Soviets continued developing the BT series, and the principles that made the prey, BT-7, successful speed, range, and reasonable firepower, influenced the design of the T-34, which would become arguably the war's most influential tank. The T-34's sloped armor, wide tracks for low ground pressure, and balance of speed and firepower all reflected lessons learned in operations like Lake Khasan. The historical significance of the Lake Khasan incident extended beyond military matters. The engagement occurred during a period of extreme tension in international relations. The Munich crisis would occur just weeks later, in September 1938. The Spanish Civil War was reaching its climax. The world was sliding toward global conflict, though few recognized the full extent of the approaching catastrophe. In this context, Lake Khasan represented a test of resolve between two expansionist powers, each seeking to establish its sphere of influence. The engagement's outcome, an indecisive military result followed by diplomatic settlement, demonstrated that neither Japan nor the Soviet Union was yet ready for full-scale war. Both needed time to prepare, to position forces, to secure their strategic situations before confronting each other decisively. The border between Soviet territory and Japanese-controlled Manchukuo remained a friction point throughout the late 1930s. The major battle at Khalkhin Gol in May through September 1939 would dwarf Lake Khasan in scale and intensity. But Lake Khasan came first, establishing patterns and revealing capabilities that would influence the larger engagement. Veterans of Lake Khasan on both sides carried memories of the engagement throughout their lives. Japanese soldiers who witnessed Soviet tanks crossing the ice never forgot the shock of seeing their intelligence assessments so thoroughly contradicted. Soviet tank crews who executed that crossing took pride in an operation that required courage, skill, and innovation. In the decades after World War II, military historians in both nations studied Lake Khasan extensively. Soviet military literature emphasized the engagement as an example of successful combined arms operations. Japanese analyses focused on the lessons learned and how they influenced subsequent doctrine development. Western historians, with access to sources from both sides, recognized Lake Khasan as an early indicator of Soviet military capabilities that would prove decisive in World War II's Eastern Front. The physical location where these events unfolded remains relatively unchanged. Lake Khasan still freezes in winter, though not typically in summer as it did during that exceptional July. The hills where Japanese and Soviet forces fought have been reclaimed by vegetation. Occasional artifacts, shell fragments, uniform buttons, equipment remnants still surface, tangible evidence of violence that occurred across these ridges and shores. Modern military forces continue studying the Lake Khasan engagement. The operation's core concept, using speed and momentum to overcome seemingly impassable obstacles, remains relevant. The integration of intelligence, planning, and execution demonstrated by Soviet forces provides a case study in operational art. The Japanese experience illustrates the dangers of assumptions unchallenged by rigorous analysis. For the individual soldiers who fought at Lake Khasan, the engagement represented a brief but intense period of combat that tested their courage, training, and endurance. Japanese infantrymen who advanced into Soviet machine gun fire showed remarkable bravery, even as their tactics proved inadequate. Soviet tank crews who crossed the ice demonstrated both technical skill and nerve. The infantry, artillery crews, and support personnel on both sides performed their duties under extreme stress. The casualties suffered at Lake Khasan, numbering several thousand killed and wounded on both sides, represented permanent losses to families and communities. Each death eliminated a son, husband, father, or brother. Each wounded soldier carried physical and psychological scars. The human cost of the engagement, often overlooked in strategic analyses, deserves recognition. The Lake Khasan incident concluded with an uneasy peace, but its lessons resonated through the following years. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Red Army's initial catastrophic defeats seemed to validate predictions of Soviet collapse. But the resilience, tactical adaptation, and industrial capacity that would eventually turn the tide had been demonstrated on a smaller scale at places like Lake Khasan. The BT-7 tanks that crossed the ice in July 1938 were largely obsolete by 1941, replaced by T-34 seconds and KV-1 second. But the doctrine that employed them, the engineering thinking that enabled the crossing, and the combined arms tactics that secured the bridgehead all contributed to the Red Army's eventual victory over Nazi Germany. For Japan, the path from Lake Khasan led through the disaster at Khalkhin Gol, the decision to strike south rather than north, Pearl Harbor, and ultimately Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Each step along that path was influenced by memories of Soviet tanks materializing across terrain Japanese planners had deemed impassable. The respect for Soviet military power that Lake Khasan instilled never entirely faded, contributing to Japan's reluctance to attack the Soviet Union, even when such an attack might have served German interests. The ice crossing itself, the image that Lieutenant Colonel Sato witnessed through his field glasses on that July morning, became symbolic of a larger truth. Military success in the modern era required not just courage and fighting spirit, but also technical sophistication, industrial capacity, and innovative thinking. The Japanese army possessed courage in abundance, but courage alone couldn't overcome the systematic material and doctrinal advantages Soviet forces demonstrated. This lesson, learned at Lake Khasan and reinforced at Khalkhin Gol, influenced Japanese strategic decision-making throughout World War II. The decision to avoid war with the Soviet Union while engaging the United States and Britain reflected calculations about relative military capability informed by these earlier conflicts. Whether these calculations were correct remains debatable, but they were undeniably influenced by memories of Soviet tanks doing the impossible. In the final analysis, the Lake Khasan incident represented a collision between different military philosophies and industrial systems. Japanese emphasis on warrior spirit and superior morale encountered Soviet focus on technical proficiency and material superiority. The engagement's outcome demonstrated which philosophy better suited modern warfare's demands. The shock Japanese commanders experienced watching Soviet tanks cross Lake Khasan on ice reflected a broader shock facing all traditional military establishments in the industrial age. War had become as much about logistics, engineering, and production as about courage and tactical brilliance. Nations that recognized this truth and adapted accordingly would prevail. Those that clung to older conceptions of warfare faced defeat regardless of their soldiers' bravery. The tanks crossing the ice that July morning in 1938 were not just military vehicles executing a tactical maneuver. They were harbingers of warfare's future, industrialized, mechanized, conducted at scales and with material resources beyond previous generations' imagination. The officers who witnessed that crossing, whether they fully understood it or not, were watching the old order being displaced by the new. When the ice finally melted that summer, it left no trace of the tanks that had crossed it. But the impact of that crossing would ripple through military history, influencing strategies, tactics, and doctrines for decades to come. The impossible crossing of Lake Khasan proved that in modern warfare, the impossible was merely the not yet accomplished, waiting for sufficient engineering skill, material resources, and operational daring to make it reality. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.